Welcome to chapter 12 of history. Today we're actually going to be doing two sections. So we're going to read, I'll go over the questions, and then we'll read a little bit more and go over the next set of questions. This is the last chapter that we're going to be reading for this year. So well done, we are here. And today we're going to be reading about education and culture in America between 1800 and 1858. So if you want to open your social studies books, we're on page 210. And we're going to be reading about what education looked like in this time period. Some highlights. Schools and textbooks got a little bit of a revival. We have literature, music, and art, and then life in the 19th century. By the early 1800s, America was clearly developing a culture distinctly different from that of Europe. Geography, immigration, a deep respect for freedom, and other factors helped make our nation unique. But nothing had a greater impact on American culture than the spiritual revivals of the Second Great Awakening. Under the influence of the Bible, Americans became concerned about their fellow men and future generations. Education, literature, music, and the arts all reflected the influence of Christianity. Education in America. As the revivals of the Second Great Awakening spread from the seaboard states to the frontier, Americans began to realize the importance of a sound education for their children. Convinced that a free people must be an educated people, they determined to prepare their children to maintain the freedoms that had been bestowed upon them in the United States of America. Thus, by the mid-1800s, American education was thriving, and the United States was the most literate nation in the world. So we're going to make note of that statement, which is kind of a coined statement at the time. So a free people must be an educated people. America soon became the most literate, which means most people who know how to read, nation in the world. All right, local schools. In the early 1800s, parents in the local community controlled the curriculum, instruction, and overall operation of the local schools. Each family paid tuition and bought books for their own children. Education was the responsibility of the family rather than the state. In addition to reading, writing, geography, and arithmetic, students were taught spiritual and patriotic values. Most children attended a one-room schoolhouse under the direction of one teacher. Students did assigned work while the teacher worked with other pupils. Because students could listen as the teacher taught their higher grades, they often knew material before they were taught it. A popular teaching technique in the schools of the 1800s was the spelling bee, which is still used today in many schools. It's like a spelling competition, if you haven't heard of it. At first, most teachers were men, but as the century progressed, many women became teachers. School boards hired only those teachers who were approved by parents. The coming of a new school teacher was a big event in most communities. If the teacher did his job well, he was one of the most respected people in town. People could often not afford to pay the teacher much money, so they made up for it by giving food, clothing, and other items to produced on farms or in their shops. So, oh goodness, the one-room schoolhouse was used in the original education system. So that means you had every grade in one school in one room. So the schoolhouses were just a square, one room, and everyone, they'd usually have boys sit on one side, girls sit on the other side, and you'd have youngest kids in the front all the way to the oldest kids in the back. And the teacher taught everyone, just kind of in small group instruction. And so that's a lot of grades in one room. You can go through, especially in New England, if you drive around, you can see original schoolhouses all over the place. Usually there was one every couple of miles so kids could walk to them. But it's usually just a square building. Sometimes they've been made into houses. Sometimes they're used as like community centers, but you can see, if you ever see a sign on the side of a little building that says schoolhouse, then that was the school for the community, which means for all the kids in that community. Traditional education. The philosophy of education followed by the early schools was basically the same that followed by Martin Luther, John Calvin, John Wesley, and English and American Puritans, and most other Christians in history. It's called the traditional education because it passes the accumulation of knowledge of the past and to the present generation. So the traditional education. Traditional education is passing accumulated knowledge of the past to the present generation. And what that means, accumulated, means every year you add more and more. So as time progressed and education progressed, all of those new knowledge points are passed on to the kids, just like we learn. And so you learn about history, you learn about where things started and up to present day, and you learn about that progress over time. Early textbooks. The blue-backed speller. It had been said that Noah Webster, 1758 to 1853, taught millions to read and not one to sin. Webster, a country school teacher, influenced 5 generations of American children through his American spelling book, nicknamed the Blue-Backed Speller. After the Bible, this book was the largest single-volume seller during the 19th century. Encased in a bright blue cover, the speller taught scripture verses, character-building stories, moral lessons, geography, and sound economics passed along with phonics and reading. The Webster spelling also taught a mastery of the English language through drills, repetition, stories, and clever devices. A Christian virtue that Webster's speller taught American school children is illustrated by the following section from an 1843 edition. He who came to save us will wash us from all sin. I will be glad in his name. A good boy will do all that is just. He will flee from vice. He will do good and walk in the way of life. I will not fear what the flesh can do to me, for my trust is in him who made the world. He is nigh to them that pray to him and praise his name. The financial profits of that Noah Webster received from the sale of his spelling books and other textbooks allowed him to support his family and work on the first dictionary of the American language that was ever published. Webster obtained a copyright to protect his claim royalties for every speller. The American system of free enterprise rewarded his hard work and creativity by providing this protection, which means if it's copyrighted, that means no one else can publish it without him getting a percentage of the money from it. All right, so we have Noah Webster created the blue-backed speller. And the first American dictionary. McGuffey's reader. Just as Noah Webster represented the godly Puritan tradition of New England, William H. McGuffey, 1800 to 1873, represented the Scots-Irish Presbyterian heritage of the Allegheny Mountains in Pennsylvania. McGuffey was a school teacher, a college professor, and a Presbyterian preacher, but he's best remembered for his reading textbooks, which sold over 122 million copies between 1836 and 1857. His readers had an especially strong influence in the schools of the Midwest, the West, and the South. McGuffey's readers were the most widely used and distributed series of school books in America. From studying McGuffey's readers, 4 generations of people learned Christian behavior, morals, geography, classical poetry, common sense, and patriotism. Selections from the work of classic authors like Shakespeare, Milton, and Byron introduced millions of young Americans to great literature. Okay, so this was the most widely used and distributed, meaning sold. All right. Public education. In colonial times, the Puritans had started a town school system financed by the local taxes and part of New England. In 1840s, Horace Mann, 1796 to 1859, promoted the idea of public primary school for all children. As the first secondary of the Massachusetts Board of Education, Horace Mann also founded the first school for the training of teacher, called a normal school. Soon the idea of public education caught on. And one of the first schools that Horace Mann built was actually in Salem, Massachusetts. Salem State College was one of the first women's colleges specifically for teachers. There's actually a Horace Mann Elementary School in Salem as well. So this is history right in our backyard, that women were first educated to be teachers right here in Massachusetts. By 1850, most children in the well-populated parts of the North attended public elementary schools. Most states and other sections of the country had at least a few elementary schools. Many people called the new public schools free schools because parents did not have to pay tuition, but all taxpayers had to pay taxes to help support the schools. The public schools of the 19th century gave students a good foundation in reading, writing, arithmetic, history, literature, and the sciences, and basic morality. Many of the teachers were Christians, and the textbooks were usually written by people who understood and believed the basic teachings of the Bible. Students also read and memorized the works of many American poets and authors. Public high schools also began in America. In the early 1800s, private academies sprang up in the North. Because many parents could not afford to send their children to such schools, some began asking for tax-supported public high schools. America's first public high school was founded in Boston in 1821. The idea spread, and soon there were high schools scattered throughout Massachusetts. Public high schools did not become widespread in New England until after the Civil War. All right, so we have Horace Mann. Promoted the idea of primary, meaning elementary, public education, which was funded by taxes instead of tuition. Public high schools also sprang up but didn't fully catch on until after the Civil War. Because at this time, many children, once you finish primary school, are going into the workforce. They are working on family farms. They are going to work in factories to help raise money for their family. And so the idea of continuing education when you were past, let's say, 10 or 11 was kind of unheard of at this time. And so the idea of a public high school that kids are now going to school until their teens, almost adulthood, is a completely new concept that took a while for people to catch on to. Then we move into higher education. Higher education. Institutions of higher education also changed during this period. The older colleges became universities, adding new departments of study for law, medicine, and science. New colleges, chartered by church organizations, sprang up throughout the country, especially in the Midwest. Georgia chartered the first state university in 1785, but the first state university began operating was the University of North Carolina in 1795. In the 1830s, educational opportunities began to open for women. In 1833, Oberlin College in Ohio became the first college to open its doors to women. Antioch College, also in Ohio, followed Obern's example. Wesleyan College, founded in Georgia in 1836, became the first college for women only. Though women could not be widely admitted to American colleges and universities until after 1850, a precedent had been established. All right, so higher education. So we have colleges and universities. Became widespread. The University of North Carolina was the first state university. So women became able to attend in the 1830s. And some of those colleges included Oberlin College, Antioch College, and Wesleyan. Libraries and lyceums. A variety of programs were instituted in the 1800s to educate the general public. Wealthy businessmen and various organizations sponsored libraries to broaden adult education. Many industrial cities provided libraries for factory workers. In 1848, Massachusetts authorized the use of public funds to support the Boston Public Library. Soon, other states passed laws permitted local communities to found tax-supported public libraries. So, libraries, every single town you go through now has a libraries, were created to educate the adult population. Almost every city had one. Boston was the first in 1848. If you think about it at this time, you have adults who are in the workforce that were children before public education was created. And so many of these adults never went to school past a primary grade and just went right into the workforce. And so this is now offering an opportunity for them to go back and to not go back to school, but to have an opportunity to take out a book or to sit in a library and read information that kids are learning in school that they never had the opportunity to learn. So it gave them a chance to self-motivate and educate themselves, but have the resources that they wouldn't normally have in their homes. Remember, this is pre-internet, pre-dictionaries being published or encyclopedias. And so having access to this kind of information in these books was a great opportunity for them. Lyceums. If you have ever been to the front building of the Sawyer Free Library, the white building that's attached to it, that is actually a lyceum. So you might say Sawyer Free Library and Lyceum. Lyceums also helped meet the demand of knowledge and culture. These organizations conducted discussions, established libraries, and worked for the establishment of public schools. They also sponsored lecture series featuring American leading political and intellectual figures. The Lyceum movement, which began in England, was fathered in the United States by Josiah Holbrook, a teacher and lecturer from Connecticut. Holbrook founded the first Lyceum in Millbury, Connecticut in 1826. Within 5 years, over 1,000 lyceums were scattered across the country. So these were organizations that promoted educational discussions, lectures, established libraries, and public schools. So they were basically organizations that were for the furthering of education, both for children and for adults. All right, some questions to answer today. Why was the United States the most literate nation in the world in the 19th century? So what was in place that allowed the furthering of education to bring America to a place of being the most literate? Next, beside reading, writing, geography, and arithmetic, what other things were stressed in schools? So go back to some of those first schools and what were some of the other things that were taught or were encouraged in those school systems? Why was it said that Noah Webster taught millions to read and none to sin? What was the topic of most of his writings in his books? Number 4, name the most widely used and distributed series of school books in America. What kind of influence did they have on the American young people? And what was the first college to accept women? What was the first women-only college? And some things to identify: spelling bees, traditional education, Webster's Dictionary, Horace Mann, University of North Carolina, libraries, lyceums, and Josiah Holbrook. You can pause this video to take time to answer those questions and then start right back up, and we will start on the next section. All right, going on to the next section, literature, music, and art. The schoolroom poets. All right, let's write a new title here. And we have literature, music, and arts. Okay. The development of American culture can also be seen in her literature. The early 1800s gave rise to the American novel, the short story, the essay, humorous writings, the periodical, literary criticism, and some of America's finest poetry. The first half of the 19th century is often referred to as the Romantic era of American literature. Romantic literature emphasized man's aspirations, emotions, individuality, personal experiences, and imagination. So we have Romantic era in America. Oh, goodness. Poets. The Romantic era of literature emphasized man's aspirations or goals, emotions, individuality, personal experiences, and imagination. It reflected Jacksonian ideas about the dignity of the common man. Students in America's schools read and memorized the works of many American poets and authors. Four New England poets in particular had a strong impact on the lives and character of all Americans. The poetry of the schoolroom poets, who were Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, John Greenleaf Whittier, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and James Russell Lowell, emphasized family values and patriotism. They were also called the fireside poets because their poetry was popular in American homes. So we're gonna move this down here. And for our romantic poets, we have Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, John Greenleaf Whittier, Oliver Wendell Holmes, James Russell Lowell. They were also called the Fireside Poets. Because they were popular in American homes. Right. The elder statesman of poetic group, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, 1807 to 1882, wrote many poems, including A Psalm of Life, Paul Revere's Ride, The Village Blacksmith, and the longer narrative poems, Evangeline, The Courtship of Miles Standish, and The Song of Hiawatha, which is perhaps the most notable literary treatment of the American Indian. Longfellow received recognition worldwide as a creative genius. He is the only American poet honored in England's Westminster Abbey. So we have Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, wrote many famous poems, and is the only American poet honored in England's Westminster Abbey. It's quite an honor. Having grown up as a Quaker in rural Massachusetts, John Greenleaf Whittier, 1807 to 1892, expressed a deep faith in Christianity in all of his poems. He strongly opposed slavery and believed that it could be ended only in God's perfect timing. Among his poems are the patriotic Barbara Frietchie, many Christian hymns as Snowbound, a masterpiece celebrating the New England countryside and family life. So John Greenleaf Whittier wrote poems and hymns that were deep in Christianity. Next, we have Oliver Wendell Holmes. A poet, essayist, medical doctor, Oliver Wendell Holmes, 1809 to 1894, was noted for his patriotic verse and good common sense. When he heard that the Constitution, a warship used in the War of 1812, was to be destroyed, he wrote a poem, Old Ironsides. The patriotic feelings produced by this work resulted in the restoration and saving of the Constitution, which can still be boarded and toured today in Boston Harbor. And that was going to be one of our field trips, along with going on the Mayflower this year, which would be in Boston, but alas, another year, another time. So Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote patriotic poems and essays, including Old Ironsides. And then we have James Russell Lowell. A man of many talents, including the arts, foreign diplomacy, law, and linguistics, James Russell Lowell of 1819 to 1891 distinguished himself through his powerful patriotic verse. The uplifting poetry of the schoolroom fireside poets represents best in American literature. Their poetry expresses respect for the Bible, Christian behavior, and a sense of duty to God, country, family, and neighbor. So he was also famous for his patriotic poems. All right, writers of novels and short stories. A New York storyteller. Eventually, the tales of other writers of the times found their way into school books. Washington Irving, 1783 to 1859, wrote many exciting tales of Dutch settlers along the Hudson River. Stories like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which features Ichabod Crane and the Headless Horseman, and Rip Van Winkle, earned him the title Inventor of the Short Story. Irving's series of humorous sketches, Knickerbocker's History of New York, became very popular in New England. So Washington Irving was called, there we go, the inventor of the short stories. Okay, and some of those famous stories were The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which is the story of the Headless Horseman, and Knickerbocker's History of New York, and Rip Van Winkle. The Leather Stocking Tales. Sometimes called America's first novelist, James Fenimore Cooper wrote exciting stories about frontier life. His books contain characters with high moral standards. Examples of his leather stocking tales included The Deer Slayer and The Last of the Mohegans. And that was even turned into a famous movie. So we have James Fenimore Cooper. First novelist, wrote stories about the American frontier. And you can imagine how these sold, because at the time, newspapers or worldwide news was not always accurate or timely. And so to be able to have a novel or a book that tells you about what life is like on the frontier, to Europeans, it's so foreign, or Asia. And so to be able to have a story that you can read about what life is really like in the American West was really a fascinating and inspiring thing. The New England novelists. Perhaps two of the greatest novelists of the 1800s were Nathaniel Hawthorne, who lived in Salem, and Herman Melville. Their understanding of the fallen nature of man allowed them to explore, through their novels, the struggle between good and evil, which makes for great literature. Nathaniel Hawthorne, 1804 to 1864, of Massachusetts, wrote many excellent works of fiction, including The House of Seven Gables and The Scarlet Letter, his best-known novel. The Scarlet Letter illustrates the reality of sin and the guilt through a story set in Puritan New England. There's actually a very large statue of Nathaniel Hawthorne in downtown Salem. And if you go through Salem, there's a lot of historical buildings and things that are attributed to him as well, either by his name or just by his history. And there's actually the House of Seven Gables that the book is written about that you can visit. So he was a famous novelist from Salem, Massachusetts, who wrote The Scarlet Letter and The House of Seven Gables. His work told about the struggle between good and evil, not food and evil. Another famous New England novelist was Herman Melville. Herman Melville, 1819 to 1891, of New York, spent several years on a whaling ship and lived among the Polynesians in South Pacific. When Melville returned home, his friends urged him to write a book about his adventures. Melville took their advice and wrote several adventure novels, including Typee, Amu, and his best-known work, Moby Dick. So he wrote novels about his experiences. He wrote Moby Dick. Master of the short story. A man of great talent, Edgar Allan Poe, 1809 to 1849, lived a lonely life marked by spiritual emptiness, which led to chronic depression. His familiarity with pain and sorrow gave him insights into strange work of dark fantasy. Poe's stories continue to be popular, partially because they are well written, and partly because they appeal to the human sense of mystery and intrigue. He introduced the detective story as a form of literature. Some of his popular tales are The Telltale Heart, The Fall of the House of Usher, The Pit and the Pendulum, and The Gold Bug, and his most popular poems include The Raven and The Bells. So we have Edgar Allan Poe. Wrote detective stories and was most famous for his poems, The Raven and The Bells. Newspapers and magazines. By the 1830s, city newspapers had become popular. Before this time, they had been printed in limited qualities for prepaid subscribers. As ordinary citizens grew more and more interested in current events, newspapers increased their circulation. First, the New York Sun began selling its newspapers daily on the street corner for a penny a copy. Within a few years, James Gordon Bennett, New York Herald, and Horace Greeley's The New York Tribune were competing in the New York City area. The demand for daily papers soon spread to other cities. The newspaper editors like Bennett and Greeley had great influence on the public opinion. Greeley, for example, used his paper to publish his opposition to slavery and alcohol consumption, and to promote support for westward expansion. New printing presses greatly aided to the newspaper business by enabling publishers to print their newspapers more efficiently. The telegraph allowed them to print current news with amazing speed. In addition to newspapers, magazines flourished. Some especially well-known magazines that influenced the public opinion throughout the nation were the Atlantic Monthly, Harper's New Monthly Magazine, and the Southern Literary Message. Goody's Ladies' Book, a popular magazine for women, featured articles on fashion and the home, as well as social issues. And so at this point, you're starting to get a widespread understanding of what other people are doing. And this is kind of, unfortunately, what our society is based on today. We have social media, we have magazines, we have the internet, we have YouTube, and it does influence how we live our own lives, or what becomes the new normal. And so before now, there wasn't really a across the board normal of what is in style, or what is the trend, or what are people thinking widespreadly about politics or education or religion. Now that you have things like newspapers and magazines where articles are being printed with public opinion and being read in other states, and things like fashion are being published so that women are getting magazines to say, this is the new style. It does shape the way we think about things. And so there became a new shift in the way people thought about their homes, how they decorated, how they dressed, what they thought about politically or religiously or educationally. And so we start to see kind of this trend of creating new cultural norms for a nation as a whole, rather than just community by community. So newspapers and magazines began to be published more efficiently and were available to the public, not just private subscribers. American music. Many Americans took interest in classical European music in the early 1800s. In larger cities, concerts became popular. Soon, schools and colleges began to offer courses in music. America also developed its own distinct music styles, including folk songs, ballads, hymns, and spirituals. In the South and the Western frontier, revivals and camp meetings produced gospel songs, which, as Wayfarer Stranger and The Old Ship of Zion, the Negro spiritual made the most distinct contribution to American music. Black slaves also introduced America to the banjo, which provided the musical accompaniment for the folk songs of the period. All right, so we have in music, so the Negro spiritual made the most distinct contribution to American music. Stephen Foster, 1826 to 1864, the best-known American composer of the time, wrote in the style of the spirituals. Foster wrote over 200 songs, including Oh, Susanna, My Old Kentucky Home, and Old Folks at Home, also called Swanee River. Though he did not make much money from his music, it was very popular in his time and is still sung a century and a half after it was written. The music educator Lowell Mason, 1792 to 1872, carried on the tradition of the singing school, started earlier by William Billings. Through these sessions, many Americans learned the basics of reading music and developed an appreciation for music, both folk and classical. American art. America produced a number of its fine painters in the late 17 and early 1800s. Gilbert Stuart, 1755 to 1828, is best remembered for his many portraits of George Washington. Charles Willson Peale, 1741 to 1827, helped found the Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia and taught many of his 17 children to paint. His son, Raphael Peale, painted still lifes and miniatures. Before the invention of the photograph, or photography, many people carried miniature paintings of their loved ones. Rembrandt Peale, another of his sons, was known for his larger portraits. The paintings of Edward Hicks, 1780 to 1849, a circuit rider, Quaker preacher, became popular because of the charm of his simplicity. Hicks painted many scenes of what he called the peaceable kingdom, a future time described by the prophet Isaiah when the lion will lie down with the lamb. And you can see a picture of that to the right, The Peaceable Kingdom by Edward Hicks. As the century progressed, other American painters established credible reputations. Asher Durand, Thomas Cole, and several others became well known for their landscape paintings of the scenes along the Hudson River. For this reason, they were called the Hudson River School. Other American painters turned their attention to the beauty of the rugged West. George Caleb Bingham painted scenes of life on the frontier, and George Catlin painted landscapes and portraits of American Indians. And on this coast, at the same time, you have Fitzhenry Lane, which they always thought was Fitzhugh Lane, but was actually Fitzhenry Lane, was a famous New England painter who lived right here in Gloucester, who painted a lot of what Gloucester Harbor looked like at this time and schooner fishing. And so this was before photography, but painted beautiful paintings about life in a fishing community in this time period. And you can see most of his works in the Cape Ann Historical Museum. So some questions to answer. First, name the fireside and schoolroom poets. What were their names? And how did their poetry influence American society for good? What did they write about that influenced the society? 2, What poem is considered the most notable literary treatment for the American Indian, and who wrote it? So go back and look at some of those schoolroom poets and look for the one that wrote about American Indians that was so famous. 3, what book illustrates the reality of sin and guilt, and who wrote it? So that battle between good and evil. And a hint was he was from Salem, Massachusetts. Number 4, what 2 newspapers competed in New York, and who were their editors? So what were the first 2 main newspapers in New York, and who were their editors? Number 5, how did revivals in the South and on the Western frontier influence the music of America? So think of that statement we said, what made the biggest impact on American music? And number 6, where did many Americans learn the basics of note reading and developed an appreciation for music? So what was developed in order for children and adults to learn about music here in America? Things to identify: the Romantic Era, Washington Irving, James Fenimore Cooper, Herman Melville, Edgar Allan Poe, Stephen Foster, Gilbert Stuart, Charles Willson Peale, Edward Hicks, and Hudson River School. So go ahead and define each of those things. Lots of people in this section that developed kind of a new cultural norm for American education and literature and art and music. And America was creating its own sense of nationalism and patriotism at this time. And education and things like the arts looked a lot different than it did in Europe. And so we see this continuation of America becoming their own society and making their own priorities and their own rules and starting a nation that's different than what they all came from. And in this case, different is a good thing because we got a lot of amazing stories and songs and poems and literature out of this time period that is still read today, which is pretty amazing. Next time, we're going to go on to the next section, which is life in the 19th century. So what did life look like living in the country, living in cities? Now that education is becoming more widespread for kids to stay in school longer, how did that affect what life looked like in America? So I will see you next time.